morning. So Petey's been asking me if I would speak at you guys, hopefully to you guys, for, I don't know, at least a year. And I kept trying to make a joke out of it, but he won. Hopefully God won. I hope you guys all hear from him and not from me this morning. This is the fourth part of the Campfire series that we've been in for the last 4 weeks. And yeah, I get to finish it up. Hopefully it ends well. We're going to be in the book of 1 Kings. Chapter 18 is where we're going to camp out this morning. But yeah, this whole series has kind of been about God showing up in his people's lives in kind of miraculous ways and reminding them who he was or telling them who he was. And today we're going to kind of do the same thing, but instead of jumping right into chapter 18, I am going to back up a little bit to chapter 11 because I'm kind of a history nerd and I really like backstories. I think history is super interesting, so whenever I can go back and read about, okay, why are people making these decisions? I think history is super helpful in discovering that. So we had a timeline that PD had been using previously in this series, and we see that we're kind of been all over this place, actually, in the last 4 weeks. God called Abraham, and he promised Abraham that he was going to have this huge family, and they were going to bless the earth, but then they kind of got stuck in Egypt for a while. And then God showed up and sent Moses to take them where he wanted them to be. And then we have a time of judges when they are in the land. And then Israel asks for a king because everyone around them had a king. And, you know, if everyone else is doing it, it makes a lot of sense, right? So God tells them it's a bad idea. But the people say, hey, we really want it. So he lets them make their decision. And Israel ends up with some kings. And if you have a chance this week, the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, is super interesting. We have King Saul, who was kind of a dud, right? We have King David, who was the best king they had, besides God, but they probably didn't recognize him as king. That's why they had David. And David has a son named Solomon. And Solomon is like, I mean, how many of you ever read anything in the book of Proverbs? He's responsible for that, and he's even responsible for some of the Psalms that are in the book of Psalms. So he's like kind of seen as this really wise person in the Bible. But I think that only took place the first 20 years of his reign, because about 20 years in, he starts to make some really stupid decisions. And he has like a ton of wives, like 400 something. I don't have the number written down. It's in chapter 11 of 1 Kings if you want to see how many wives he had. And he decided that he loved these wives so much and he wanted to impress them and make them feel welcome. I mean, if a house full of wives doesn't make you feel welcome as a wife. Anyways, so he starts building these houses and these temples all over Jerusalem for their wives' gods and their idols that they serve, because he was marrying these wives out of like military alliances, and we invade a place but we don't want to kill you all off, so we'll marry some of your royal women so that you feel important still. So to make them feel even more important, he welcomes these other gods that are not the God of Israel into the land. And in chapter 11 of 1 Kings, we read that the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime." He was probably like, whew, not my problem. "I will tear it out of the hand of your son, Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but I will give him one tribe for the sake of David my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. So he's given this basically ultimatum, and he still doesn't change his ways. He not only builds temples and lets the wives worship these other idols, but he starts to worship them. He shows up to him, he gives sacrifices. His heart didn't serve God completely. It wasn't that he stopped worshiping God. He still went to the temple and offered sacrifices, but his heart wasn't fully devoted to him. And God's not about that. So he does what he says he will do, and the kingdom splits. Oh, the timeline's not still up there, but that's okay. There was the reign of the kings, which was really 3 of them that had the entire kingdom, and then when Solomon dies, his son inherits the kingdom, and he makes some pretty stupid decisions, and northern kingdom, southern kingdom. So God, all the way, isn't done with Israel. In fact, he is pursuing Israel like crazy. He's showing up in some awesome ways during this time. And one way he does that is he's sending prophets to Israel. And the job of the prophets was to, hey, I need your attention. God needs your attention. Focus back over here, okay? And the prophets were sometimes successful, but usually they weren't. On a very rare occasion, did a king of Israel turn back to God, and the people pretty much just followed their king. But God was directly involved, and he's trying so hard to get Israel's attention. It's kind of heartbreaking when you read 1 Kings, because he's so involved in such an awesome way, and people are just kind of like, eh. So we have kings sometimes turning to God, but the tendency was corrupt kings replacing even more corrupt kings replacing kings. It just kept getting worse. But through this whole passage, the whole first half, the whole book of the Bible, really, but books of the Bible, but 1 Kings, we see that God is faithful to Israel in at least 2 ways. And I think if you have your notes, you can go ahead and pull them out. I will try to stick to that. Who knows what will happen. God is faithful to Israel in at least 2 ways. Number 1, we just talked about in 1 Kings chapter 11. He was going to tear the kingdom apart, but he was going to remain faithful to who? David, yeah. So he preserved the house of David, which is really important, and we're going to come back to that in a little bit. But he was also faithful to Israel because he kept sending the prophets, prophet after prophet. It wasn't just one. Every king had a prophet that would try to direct their heart back to God. And most of them were ignored. Not only ignored, but killed. A lot of them were killed. See, this is something super interesting about God, something that we should really try to grasp. Because God's faithfulness to Israel wasn't based on anything Israel had done. God's faithfulness has everything to do with who he is and nothing to do with who we are. That was the case for Israel, and that's the case for us still. If you read all of the account up to chapter 18, Israel never by accident turned back to God. It was because of God's direct involvement. So, I think it's also interesting to note that if we follow the Bible all the way through, we see that God's faithfulness to Israel wasn't just good for them, it was good for us. Because God's faithfulness to Israel is also God's faithfulness to you and me. Because it was through Israel, specifically King David, that Jesus showed up eventually. And the people of God no longer just included Israel, these wandering people, but it also includes you and me. We're not just God's people. We're actually called sons and daughters of God, which is just mind-blowing. But the road to Jesus was super bumpy and dangerous. and kind of ugly one to watch. We meet some pretty terrible kings along the way. A lot of people die. A lot of people make some pretty stupid decisions. We think our nation is bad. I mean, it is. But it was ugly to look at. It's ugly to read some of these chapters. One of these kings we meet is King Ahab, and he's going to be one of the central characters today in chapter 18 of 1 Kings. We first meet him in 1 Kings chapter 16, and there's no doubt what kind of king he's going to be. We read in verse 30 of chapter 16. It's going to be on the right there. So Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. Now, pause real quick. Jeroboam, he was the first king of the northern kingdom. And he was a pretty bad guy. I mean, God used him to punish Israel. But he was so paranoid that the northern kingdom would turn back to the line of David that he said, you know what? You're not allowed going to Jerusalem and worshiping God in the temple anymore. In fact, I'm going to make these 2 golden calves. Does that sound familiar? Mount Sinai? That didn't go well for them in their past, and it didn't go well for them here when it happened again. And he told them, hey, Israel, these are your gods. These 2 calves, they are the ones that brought you out of Egypt. So he specifically told Israel to stop worshiping God. God didn't deal very kindly with him. But here's this guy, Ahab, and he doesn't even think that's a big deal. Jeroboam's issues. But to make it worse, he married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. I'm sorry. Every time I read that, I think that sounds like a Star Trek race or something. It's not. So this daughter of this king who served and worshipped Baal. And then Ahab sets up an altar to Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. By the way, Samaria is the capital of the northern kingdom. So it's not just like this random back village like Obi. It was like Washington, D.C. or Albany, New York. It was the capital. That's where everyone came. So he built up this altar in a temple that he built for this false god named Baal. He also made an Asherah pole and did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than did all the kings of Israel before him. So, we're going to pause real quick and look at these 2 characters. One is Ahab. Kind of get a gist that he's not a good guy, right? And we also have Baal. Now, Baal, it was this Canaanite deity. If any of you guys know what Canaan was, it was basically the land of Israel before God gave it to Israel, or Israel claimed it because God gave it to them. And he was this deity that was basically responsible for storms and fertility. One of his nicknames was the Rider of the Clouds. Like he would, lightning and fire come down from the sky when Baal was ticked off or something. Which, if you think about it, storms and fertility are pretty closely connected in this culture, very agricultural, right? All of their economy was based on the land. So they would pray to Baal, and he would send rain, and they would have plenty of crops, and they would be able to feed all of these animals, which Baal would also bless so that they could have huge fields full of cattle and sheep. And they basically accredited this all to Baal. In fact, before they came into the land, Baal was accredited for the land that was once called the land flowing with milk and honey. Remember that? I mean, they thought that was because Baal. They worshiped Baal, and they did something for Baal, and Baal blessed them. And that whole area is actually, if you know your social studies or history, or whatever they call it in school today, that was called the Fertile Crescent in there. It was super abundant with basically anything you ever wanted. And a lot of that was accredited to this idol, this god named Baal. So this was the idol that had captured Israel's heart. And when I say captured, I don't mean that they had to exclusively worship Baal, because in their culture, it wasn't about, my God is better than your God. It was, hey, why don't we diversify our worship and worship all of these little gods, and then we can have all our bases covered, you know? So it's not like you couldn't worship Yahweh, which is the name God gave Israel when he appeared to Moses, but why not worship these other gods that could come along and give you a good, fertile crop, big family? This is what makes the God of Israel so different from all the gods in the land, because he demanded the entire heart of his people. He wasn't interested in sharing it. He wasn't interested in an open relationship with Israel. And he's the same God today. He's not interested in an open relationship with us. He wants all of our hearts. God doesn't share our hearts with idols. He says it like this in the law, in Exodus chapter 34. He says, "For you shall worship no other gods. For the Lord," by the way, that is spelled capital L-O-R-D. Well, it might not be up there. Capital L-O-R-D, all caps, that's actually the word Yahweh, the name that he gave Israel. So if I randomly say the word Yahweh, call God Yahweh, it's because God is really a bad title to try to describe our God, because it just describes a thing, not a person. And Yahweh gave us his name. So to keep myself from getting too confused, which is hard enough already, I am going to use that from time to time. So you shall worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. I think that is a super interesting name for God. Probably one that we don't pay attention to very much. The Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. See, God is jealous for our hearts. I just want to take a moment and let that sit in. Like, how ridiculous is that sentence? God is jealous for my heart. What about that sentence makes any sense? What about us is worth being jealous about? I mean, this is the God of the universe. He can have whatever he wants, and he's jealous for my heart? I mean, say that to yourselves. God is jealous for my heart. Like, out loud. God is jealous for my heart. I think we have to realize that. Because, I mean, jealousy is not like a positive characteristic trait, right? It usually comes with a sense of ownership. Like if you're jealous of someone, you have a claim on whatever it is you're jealous about, right? So God isn't, when he says he's jealous for Israel, he's jealous for us, he is saying he has a claim to us. And this is like the gospel, guys. Goes all the way back to the garden. This is why God created us, to be with him. And we show up rebellion after rebellion, and we think we can share his heart. Israel thinks they can share his heart with idols. And you can't share all of your attention with something when something else is demanding it constantly. And that's what idols do. They demand our attention. They take our focus off of whatever we're focused on, and they demand, hey, look at me, look at me. They demand that we stress over it, that we worry about it. Idols demand our attention, and that's why idols can't exist in God's presence. It's impossible to be in God's presence and focus on anything other than him. When I first thought about this, I was like, man, there's not going to be any ADHD in God's presence. Like, it's just not going to be there. Teachers are going to be like rejoicing. It's impossible to be in God's presence and focus on anything other than him. That's why we can't serve or worship or have idols in our hearts or in our lives and be in God's presence. Because our focus will be on him. So the question is, what is God going to do to bring their hearts back? And that's when we read, a couple chapters later, about a guy named Elijah. How many of you have ever heard of Elijah? He's a pretty cool character. There's some awesome stories, and you're probably familiar with this story about Elijah and the prophets of Baal and the showdown. Fire comes, and everyone's like, whoa, this is awesome. Well, we're going to kind of work our way through the story. And we're going to look at 1 Kings chapter 17 to start with, which is page 283 in the Pew Bibles, if you're using one of those. Verse 1, it'll also be on the screen. So, verse 1. Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except by my word. Now, Elijah is saying a couple different things with just this simple statement. There's not going to be any rain, except when I say so. First, isn't Baal supposed to be the guy that's in charge of the rain and fertility and stuff? So he's marching in and telling a guy that, hey, your God doesn't have control over this. Baal isn't the one in charge here. But then he's also telling him that the land is about to dry up, which is the very economy of the people. So the economy is about to dry up. And when people aren't happy, I don't know what that is. When people aren't happy, their kings don't tend to last very long. So his job security is about to dry up. But we don't really know how Ahab responds to Elijah, because in the next sentence, God tells him to go somewhere else. But my guess is that Ahab really didn't take him seriously. Because, think about it, there's some appeal in Baal worship. Maybe not for us, but if we break this apart, there is. Because if all they have to do to receive the rain, to be successful, is go to Baal, offer a sacrifice, do this, do that, say this, dance around in a circle in some random temple, and then leave, Baal will send the rain, right? The control was all in the worshiper. If they gave this, if they did this, Baal would respond with this. So it's kind of like a vending machine. My dad used to work on vending machines, I was really young, so I don't really remember it, but I remember being excited to go with him because that means I got like a free Twinkie or something. I don't know. But vending machines basically work like you put $1 or a quarter in, you poke a few buttons, and out pops a Klondike bar. Well, probably not. It'll be melted if it was. But I mean, that's kind of how idol worship works. Right? I do, then I receive. So, Ahab wasn't too worried that Elijah's God wasn't going to give him anything because he wasn't giving him anything out anyways. He had water that God didn't know about, right? Your vending machine might not work, but I have this one over here, and I've got plenty of quarters and sacrifices. I mean, I'm the king. I can just take whatever I want and give it to Baal. And what will Baal do? Well, he has to give us rain because that's his job. That's what he is. So I really don't think Ahab was too worried. He didn't take him seriously. But it wasn't really Elijah's job to convince Ahab. He was just obedient and he relayed a message. Yahweh proves his own word, and he always has. So in the next verse, verse 2, then the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kithron ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook. I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there. So he did what the Lord had told him. He went to the Kithron ravine, east of the Jordan, and stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. Okay. So this is really cool to see how God provides for Elijah. Elijah obeyed God, and then this horrible thing was coming, but even in the midst of it, Elijah was going to be affected by obeying God too. The drought was going to happen in all the land. He obeyed God, and God provided for him. But when I was reading this, I had a thought. I think our tendency to, PD talked about this last week, the idea that God doesn't owe us anything for our obedience. And our tendency to read this is think, oh, well, if we just be like Elijah and obey God, that he'll provide all of this. I do, God gives. Which sounds a lot like Baal worship. So, what is different about Elijah here? And I think one big difference is Elijah's obedience wasn't about Elijah. God was doing something in Elijah, right? We see, this is like Cinderella level provision here. Like birds are coming with bread and feeding him every morning and every evening. And, I think if we put ourselves in that scenario, we would have a hard time thinking of that as a blessing. Hey, let's go hide out in the desert and drink from some stream someplace. Hopefully it's not downhill from a village. And let's eat some meat that's not FDA approved. Who knows where that came from? By the way, crows just brought it to you. And bread, where did this bread come from? There was probably a baker up in some village super annoyed that these birds keep stealing his bread every morning. That's not a vacation. Yeah, we love camping, but we don't love camping like that for 3 years. So, yeah, this was God providing for him, but it wasn't pretty for Elijah. But Elijah's obedience wasn't just about Elijah. God was doing something around Elijah. He was using Elijah to bring an entire nation back to him, to get their attention. I think when it comes to us, when we struggle with this, do I obey God or don't I? When we ask that question, we already know the answer. But I think it is good to look not only what God is doing in us, but what God is doing around us. How does this affect others? It affected all of Israel. If we skip forward to chapter 18, we see the scenario has changed a lot for Israel. After a long time, verse 1 of chapter 18, page 283, which might be the same one as before. After a long time, in the 3rd year, the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send the rain on the land. So Elijah went to present himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria. And Ahab had summoned Obadiah, his palace administrator. Obadiah was a devout believer in the Lord, while Jezebel, Ahab's wife, was killing off the Lord's prophets. Obadiah had taken 100 prophets and hid them in 2 caves, 50 in each, and had supplied them with food and water. So Ahab runs into Obadiah, and Ahab says to him, go through the land to all the springs and valleys. Maybe we can find some grass to keep the horses and mules alive so we won't have to kill any of our animals. This is a pretty dire situation. So they divided the land they were to cover, Ahab going in one direction and Obadiah in another. As Obadiah was walking along, Elijah met him. Obadiah recognized him, bowed down to the ground and said, is it really you, my lord Elijah? Yes, he replied. Go tell your master Elijah is here. What have I done wrong? Asked Obadiah, that you are handing your servant over to Ahab to be put to death. As surely as the Lord your God lives, there is not a nation or kingdom where my master has not sent someone to look for you, probably to turn the rain on and then turn the water back on and then kill him. And whenever a nation or kingdom claimed you were not there, he made them swear they could not find you. So not only did he look for them in the nation, but he made that nation go look for him, for Elijah. But now you tell me to go to my master and say, Elijah is here. I don't know where the Spirit of the Lord may carry you when I leave. I love that he says that because he's saying something about God. that he's unpredictable, right? The culture is so used to a predictable God. I do this, he does this. And Obadiah knows that, yeah, it might be your will to go talk to Ahab, but God does what he wants. And when I go, I'm left with no proof. Where did you go? God is unpredictable. He does what he wants. If I go and tell Ahab and he doesn't find you, he will kill me. But I, your servant, have worshipped the Lord since my youth. Haven't you heard, my Lord, what I did when Jezebel was killing the prophets of the Lord? I hid 100 of the prophets in 2 caves, 50 in each, and supplied them with food and water. And now you tell me to go to my master and say, Elijah is here. He will kill me. And then Elijah responds, as the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, I will surely present myself to Ahab today. I really like his response because it seems so, yeah, that's nice, but this is my mission and I'm going to do it. Now, Obadiah had a right to fear for his life. I mean, Ahab wasn't the most reasonable or sane ruler that Israel had had in the last 300 years. I wouldn't want to cross him. But in this story, we also see that Obadiah had God's provision on his life every step of the way also. I mean, he was serving a horrible guy in his palace. And as far as we can tell, Obadiah was a godly person. It says he served the Lord since his youth. He was a youth. He was a devout believer in the Lord. But there came a point in Obadiah's life, and I think there comes a point in our life where we have to realize that God's faithfulness hasn't just been a past fluke, like an accident, right? We can reason away God's faithfulness. Oh, well, I mean, people in Africa can figure out how to have a meal every day. God's faithful to them too. I mean, that's just how it works. It's like we're all superstitious and we can reason away God's faithfulness. But Obadiah knew God was faithful to him. God's faithfulness wasn't just some past fluke, wasn't just some luck. And if God was faithful in the past to Obadiah, he was going to be faithful in the future to Obadiah. So, he's at this crisis, but let's face it, Elijah doesn't really give him much of a choice. Well, I'm going to talk to Ahab today. Not in a week. I'm not giving you time. I'm doing it today. So then we read in 16. So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. When he saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you troubler of Israel?" I think those are fighting words. I'm not fluent in fighting words or Hebrew. But he was basically saying, all of this problem, everything that's wrong with Israel right now is your fault. We're in trouble because of you. And probably Ahab wasn't the only one who thought that, because he wasn't the only one being affected. All of Israel was being affected by this drought. They were all suffering. So I have a feeling that a lot of people were quick to blame Elijah because he was the one who said, God's turning the water off. But he's quick to remind him that it wasn't God and it wasn't Elijah that got Israel in all this trouble. In verse 18, "I have not made trouble for Israel," Elijah replied, "but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's command and have followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me at Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table," aka these people who are state-sponsored religious people. So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets at Mount Carmel. So why did God send Elijah to Ahab in the first place? Feel free to shout it out. Why did he send him back? Well, the rain was off, and then he came to him and he told him to go back to Ahab for what? He's going to turn the water back on, right? That was his mission, turn the water back on. So what did any of this have to do with Mount Carmel? Well, it just so happens that Mount Carmel wasn't just this random location, like, oh, it's got a beautiful view, let's meet there. And they weren't going to have a picnic there. It was like a sacred place in Baal worship. It was this big like mountain range. Did you guys know that PD went to Israel? He's got some pictures. They visited this place, right? And he's got some pictures. I should have brought some up. I forgot to ask. But it overlooks, it's kind of like this mountain range, but it overlooks part of the Mediterranean Sea. So it was like this great place to see the weather rolling in off of the sea and coming into Israel, into the land. So it was like the sacred place where there were probably already prophets worshiping Baal, trying to convince him to turn the water back on during this last 3 years of drought. It wasn't just this random place. Elijah was giving them home court advantage, okay? They were already there, and this was like a hot spot for Baal to show up. If he was going to show up, this would be the place. So Ahab agrees, and in the next sentence we see that Elijah is talking to everyone assembled at Mount Carmel. Now, mind you, there are about 850 prophets from the two different gods they serve, plus the people. We don't really know how many people were there, but I'm guessing it was a pretty large number. They probably wanted to see Elijah get his for turning off the water. And plus a king. And then Elijah gives them this question. He doesn't seem too worried about the numbers, because he was outnumbered. And he wasn't just outnumbered, he was alone. And he asks them, steps right up, he says, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." But the people said nothing. No one said anything. No one was going to back this guy up. In the culture that Israel was becoming, might makes right. Okay? Whichever side has more people, that's the side that I want to be a part of, right? So if numbers were any indication, it was game over for Elijah before he even started. So I think his boldness in asking this question probably confused them, but I think the question of picking one or the other probably confused them also. See, to us, if we grew up in the church, we kind of know this idea that God wants all of our hearts. You can't serve this thing and this thing. You can't serve. I can't imagine how horrible. I don't have one wife, and Solomon had to serve a lot. 700, thank you. Okay, so it must have been hard for him, but serving God is so much bigger than serving a wife. And they probably thought it wasn't, why? Why do we have to pick one or the other? Why can't we have both? Why can't I use two different vending machines? Twice the blessing, right? And that's what it was really about. It was about blessing. They received. And they thought, oh, well, if I do more for two different gods, then I'll receive more from two different gods. Why do I have to choose one or the other? But if you think about a vending machine, who's in control of it? You are, the operator, right? So he's not just saying, choose one to follow. He's saying, keep leading yourselves, since you have complete control. You figured out Baal enough. You have control over him. You can lead yourselves, or you can follow God, but you can't lead and follow at the same time. So Elijah, in verse 22, said to them, "I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. And I will prepare another bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire, he is God." And then the people said, "What you say is good." Okay, so these are the same people who've been praying to Baal for 3 years to send the rain, and they were still completely confident that, well, he won't send the rain, but maybe he'll send the fire. He really likes dry things. This will just make it easier for him. So, Elijah repeats himself in verse 25. It says, choose one of the bulls and prepare it first, since there are so many of you. Call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire. So they took the bull given to them and prepared it. They called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. Baal, answer us, they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar they had made. So, again, Elijah's giving them the upper hand. He's saying, you guys go first. Which, by the way, if Baal had shown up, like, he's risking a lot here by saying, go ahead. Yeah, you go first. Because if Baal had shown up, that means, yeah, there's more than one God in Israel. And that would be a huge defeat for Yahweh. For Elijah, he'd probably be killed. So he's giving him the upper hand again. And then he starts to mock Baal. This is fun to read. There's a couple different translations that would be interesting to read how they describe some of the taunts that Elijah throws at these guys. But as he's saying these taunts, he's bringing attention to how ridiculous their God is and how ridiculous their worship is. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. Shout louder, he said. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is in deep thought or busy. I think it's the one that's busy in NIV. I think if you read in some other translations, it's actually translated, he is like using the facilities. Yeah. Maybe he's going to the bathroom or traveling. Maybe all three. Maybe he is asleep and he must be awakened. You got to shout louder. So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response, no one answered, no one paid attention. When I first read that, that hits you hard. What if that was our experience as Christians? Why are we even here if God doesn't respond? There was no response, no one answered, no one paid attention. The vending machine was broken. How many of you have ever tried to put $1 in a vending machine and it kicks it back out? So you gotta take the $1 and do the shuffle on the side of the machine, or maybe it doesn't accept your quarters because they're too worn down, or maybe you're using the wrong quarters. It doesn't accept Bitcoins, so I can't use those, right? They have those ones with the fancy, I guess it's not fancy, it's probably standard now. You can just use your card on the vending machine. That's pretty easy, right? Well, this vending machine wasn't taking any of that. It was out of order. It was like it was unplugged. Because Baal didn't exist. Verse 30. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come here to me." They came to him. I think it's interesting that they're listening to him now. He's telling them to do something and they're, oh, well, okay, let's do what Elijah says. They came to him and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. So there was already an altar to the God of Israel in this location, but it had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob. So this altar represents all of God's people, not just the northern kingdom, which is important to note. To whom the word of the Lord had come saying, where did I say this? Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord came saying, your name shall be Israel. With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it, large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. I think that's like 4 gallons. There's probably a note in your Bibles if you have notes in it to tell you what that measurement actually is. He arranged the wood, cut the bowls into pieces, bowl into pieces and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, "Fill 4 jars of water and pour it on the offering and on the wood." "Do it again," he said to them, and they did it again. "Do it a 3rd time," he ordered, and they did it a 3rd time. The water ran down the altar, around it, and even filled the trench. So, again, giving Baal and the Baal worshippers an advantage. But also, I think his confidence in God is pretty remarkable here. Because he doesn't just have reasonable confidence in God, he has unreasonable confidence in God. I mean, wet things don't burn. Maybe with enough gasoline, but they haven't discovered that yet. Okay, well, anyways, he was making it harder for God. But he knew that if God was going to shoot down fire from heaven, a little bit of water wasn't going to be an issue. Also, where did he get the water? There's a drought in the land. Why is he wasting it on the altar? I think people were probably confused. I think he confused a lot of people. Verse 36, at the time of sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed. "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all of these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." Compare this prayer to the one that the prophets of Baal had just done. The prophets of Baal were trying so hard and so desperately to get the attention of their God. They thought that they could work up some affection from him or some pity from him by cutting themselves. Surely he doesn't want us to be in pain, so if we hurt ourselves, he'll pay attention. They were striving so hard to get his attention. And what is Elijah saying? He's saying the people already have God's attention. We have God's attention. Elijah's prayer was humble. It acknowledged what God had already done. It remembered his faithfulness. And he was confident that because God was faithful, he would do what he said he would do. He would turn the hearts back of his people. There was no amount of striving that Elijah could do or the people could do to get his attention because they already had it. How does this compare to the way we pray? Now, obviously, we aren't Baal worshipers, right? That seems like a stupid thing to do. But do we think like one? Do we think like an idol worshiper? If I do this, if I obey God, if I do what he says, he will bless me. Or at least he won't take away a blessing. Do we think we have to get more of God's attention somehow by doing good things? Striving is not a characteristic of a child of God. Striving is a characteristic of a Baal worshiper, a slave. Someone who thinks they have God figured out to the point that it's a formula. I do this, I receive this. God was already eager to get his people's attention. And now all eyes were on the altar that Elijah had just repaired. So God wasn't going to waste their attention. So what happens? Verse 38, then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil. And it also licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell on their face. They fell face down and cried. The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. I love this, their response. When God shows up, he gets all of the attention. And really, there's no more appropriate response than to worship when God shows up. Now, he's not just bringing their hearts back with this. This isn't the first time that God shot fire out of the sky. In fact, it happened 3 other times in Israel's history. Once in the tabernacle during its first service. The tabernacle was like this portable tent that they would carry around. God shot down fire from the sky to receive the first offering that they made there. It happened once when King David was offering a sacrifice to God on the place where the temple would be built. And it also happened during the first ceremony, the dedication of the temple, when Solomon completed it. So those, I think I put the references in your notes on that, so you can feel free to look that up. But it was like this sign. Israel was familiar with this. God shoots fire out of the sky, and what's it a symbol of? It was a symbol that God was receiving their sacrifice, that he accepted this act of worship, that it was appropriate. And when God receives their sacrifice, it means that he has dealt with their sin, and they could live in his presence. So he's reminding them, yeah, this is what the covenant looks like. This is the provision I have given you already. And then he's also accepting them back into his presence so that they can live there. But this isn't the end of the story. Because verse 40 takes kind of a turn that a lot of people are like, oh, well, that's not a story I can tell my kids anymore. Verse 40, then Elijah commanded them, seize the prophets of Baal, don't let anyone get away. They seized them, and Elijah had brought them down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there. That escalated quickly. I mean, slaughtered? That seems a bit harsh, right? I mean, we're 21st century Americans. Nobody slaughters anyone for a good reason. What are we supposed to do with that? I think Elijah makes it abundantly clear that God takes idolatry seriously. Giving away our hearts always has consequences, and God deals with sin completely. One Old Testament theologian says it like this: God uses surgery, not breath mints, on cancer. I'm going to say that one more time. God uses surgery, not breath mints, on cancer. He doesn't turn a blind eye to sin. He doesn't ignore it or cover it up. He deals with it, and he removes it from his people because it can't be in his presence. But slaughter? I mean, God doesn't deal with sin that way anymore, does he? I'm going to read some pieces of Isaiah 53 real quick. He was oppressed and afflicted. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. By oppression and judgment, he was taken away, for he was cut off from the land of the living. He was assigned a grave with the wicked. It was the Lord's will to crush him and to cause him to suffer. Does God still deal with sin so harshly? These are the words of the prophet Isaiah, and they were fulfilled in Jesus. This is exactly how God dealt with sin and idolatry on the cross. We have this tendency to think, oh, well, the God of the Old Testament was so much more harsh than the God of the New Testament, right? He's all about love and graciousness in the New Testament, and the Old Testament kind of shows us this harsh, wrathful God. Slaughter is exactly the right word, because that is exactly what happened to Jesus on the cross. See, the wrath of God doesn't make him horrible or hard to look at, because it magnifies the love of God, because he was willing to go all the way to the cross and do something that we couldn't. Romans 8:3 says, for what the law was powerless to do because it was weakened by the flesh. Here's this law, it's great, it works when it works, but guess what? We have to follow it, and we aren't capable of it. We keep sinning constantly. It was weakened by the flesh. God accomplished by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh to be a sin offering. God completely dealt with sin. He takes it seriously, and if we want to be a people who live in his presence, he has to remove it from us. God dealt with my sin and your sin just as harshly as Elijah dealt with those prophets. The only difference, it isn't you and me laying in a ravine someplace dead. It was Jesus on a cross who did that. This is what I love about the Old Testament, but even just this story, it all points to Jesus. Amen. So, when I was reacting to this story, thinking through it, there were three things that I want to do. First, I want to look for God's faithfulness in my life. And not just like think about it once in a while. I have this little notebook in my car above my visor. Don't go look at it. But when I'm driving, it's a really good time to just like turn off the radio and just think about, okay, what is God doing in my life? How is he faithful to me? And I think we have to be intentional every day to look for how God is being faithful to us. Because if we don't look for it every day, we're going to be like the Israelites, meandering along, and randomly we discover, oh, I'm worshiping an idol. How did my cell phone become an idol? So if we remember God's faithfulness in our life every day, I think we also need to identify idols in our lives. These things that demand our attention to the point where they take attention away from God. And we have to deal with them harshly, which is really hard to do, especially if no one else knows it's an idol in your life. But if you don't deal with the idol, God will, because he is jealous for your heart. He wants your attention. He's not willing to share your attention with idols. And third, I think we should respond, because if we're not idol worshipers, right, everything we do is actually a response. We're not doing it to get something from God. We've already received everything he has. And I think our response to him is worship, not to get something from him, but because we've already received everything from him. We like to say worship is our response to God for who he is and what he does. And just like the Israelites who declared, the Lord, he is God, the Lord, he is God, I think we should declare that with our whole lives. Will you guys stand and pray with me?